So tonight we're going to be talking about the relationship between the journalists, and I'm excited that I have these wonderful ladies who have agreed to join me. Ana-Claire has had experience at CNN and sort of more the live on TV type of experience, and Ariela has been an amazing freelance writer. I'm going to let the two of them tell you more about their experiences. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, like a 2-minute introduction. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this relationship between the whistleblower and the journalist. And what are some of these rules of engagement? Because I think that's something I find I do spend a lot of time trying to explain and help people understand. Just some of those, and I'll give you just sort of heads up to think about, some of these things, like what does it mean to be on background and off the record, on the record. So I think we'll focus on some of that here in a minute, but I'll go in sort of alphabetical order. We'll start with Ana-Claire. Why don't you introduce yourself and just give us the highlights of your career?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ana-Claire Stapleton. So I'm a conflict journalist. I spent the last 16 years of my career at CNN. For the first 10 years, I did domestic conflict, so any kind of terrorist attack, mass shooting, things of that nature. And then the last 8-ish years, I've done international conflict. So I've deployed to Ukraine 4 times since the Russian invasion, in and out of other conflict zones. I'm also, in addition to being a conflict journalist, I'm a military spouse. So I do a lot of reporting in the past on military connected types of stories revolving around things that our families deal with that are unique to service members and things of that nature. I actually just left CNN a couple months ago to focus on ibogaine awareness, which ibogaine is a plant-based medicine that's showing a lot of promise in helping those that are dealing with brain injuries, like traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also substance abuse. So that's what I've been focused on the last couple months. But I'm still very involved in the military community, as well as, keep track of everything that's going on around the world. And eventually after this year, where I'm going to focus on ibogaine awareness, I do plan on going back into conflict journalism. And thank you for having me.
Oh, good. Yes, I have a lot of questions about that variety of things that you've been doing. Jack of all trades. Ariela, why don't you say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ariela Steinhorn. Also, Ana-Claire, I have a military spouse story for you, so we should connect after this. But so I actually started my career in corporate PR, and I'm one of the few people who went from PR to journalism. So I worked at Uber in their corporate PR and public policy team in the early days when things were very chaotic. It was like 20 of us, and then worked at a number of other tech startups, saw under the hood, saw the emperor had no clothes, and decided that I wanted to start my own thing where I would be bringing people's workplace stories forward. Usually they were very sensitive workplace stories, and helping bridge the connection between sources and journalists. And I still do that work, working with whistleblowers and other people who may have sensitive stories that they want to bring to journalists. And then I've started to write under my own byline as well. As Jackie mentioned, I'm a freelance journalist. I've been published in the New York Times, Slate. I have a few other pieces coming out. I just launched a newsletter 2 days ago with a former New York Times labor journalist, focused on tech and power and labor. And so it's a bit of working directly with whistleblowers on all of their needs related to get their stories out there, and then also some of my own writing and investigations.
Very good. Okay, so I'm a whistleblower. What is it that you need to hear from me to make you think my story is compelling? And if not you as a journalist, then who would you recommend that I look for?
Is this for me?
Yeah, why don't we'll let you say.
Well, so I think that it's interesting because there's always this balance between the micro and the macro of like the person's very individual story and what they're facing with like the boss who's been terrorizing them, and then there's the macro, like what does this mean for the public? Is this in the public interest? And sometimes you have both, where it's, you know, a really terrible micro situation and a terrible macro situation. So I first kind of go through, I hear people out on the more like personal side of things, and then I see if there's something broader, something cultural or societal that is implicated in what they're saying, and also are there other people like them? So that's the first question that I ask sometimes, because there's power in numbers, and you can also be more anonymous in the media that way if there are more of you. So I think it's a variety of balancing those two sides of things, and I think the public interest piece obviously is critical, and I feel like this audience knows that. But then I think the micro is also really important too, how because it humanizes the person. It's not just, it's a very human story, as opposed to just something that feels very far off to readers or viewers or whoever is consuming the information. So I've heard stories about fraud, sexual assault and harassment, environmental concerns, a lot of defrauding the government, which is being like twisted now, Doge people. I work with a lot of women who talk about hostile workplaces for women, and just generally any sort of power abuse. So, and then I look for, does the person have evidence, and can they share things with me clearly and cleanly when I ask them questions, while understanding they probably are traumatized to some extent.
Yeah, so evidence is definitely a question I want to come back to, but Ana-Claire, so, I mean, you're working in TV journalism. Is there a different bar for television than maybe print or radio? Do you feel like you have or there was a different level or standard for a story?
No, I wouldn't say specifically because the medium, it's a different level. And, you know, primarily most of my reporting is done on digital platforms. I mean, because right now everything's kind of moving away from television journalism and onto digital platforms. I mean, that is where we all get our information. You asked how to identify like the right journalists, on who are you going to trust with your information. I think that, you know, not all journalists, they're equipped to handle sensitive leaks. It doesn't matter what type of medium they're using, whether it's TV or print or radio. I think you want to look for reporters that have a history of investigative work or national security reporting, depending on specifically what it is that you want to, you know, what your leak or what your whistleblowing content is about. You want to try and find somebody that covers topics related to your specific disclosure, and then have also maybe previously worked with really you know, sensitive source information and handled those leaks responsibly. I would, you know, look for investigative teams at, you know, major media outlets, and then also journalists that are affiliated with organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists or Freedom of the Press Foundation, because they typically have a better understanding of what that source relationship will look like in order to protect the whistleblower as best that they can while the story progresses further and then once it's published.
So let's go back to this issue of evidence, because I think that becomes sort of key to whether the story reaches the point where you might want to pursue it. And I think, you know, just to kind of also pivot, I think whistleblowers need to follow what you just said about who you're interviewing, and don't give your story to the first reporter. I mean, find the right one, because I've had great experiences with reporters like the two of you, but I have been burned by reporters, and I know other whistleblowers who thought they were going to be on background and then saw their name in the paper and were fired. So I think it's all about that relationship, but I think a key point to the relationship starts with, what's the evidence? So what are you looking for when we start talking about what evidence makes a story?
Do you want to take it, Ariela? You want me to take it?
I can, you go first, and then I'll add it.
You know, I don't think that there's a blanket statement. I think it depends on what it is that they're bringing, you know, trying to bring truth to light, right? So we have this mutual dependence with different motivations. So the whistleblower, they might step forward believing the public deserves to know about wrongdoing or the corruption, abuse of power. but their motivations could range from moral conviction to personal grievances. But ultimately, they want the journalist to amplify the message, right, and ensure that the claims that they're saying are made public. But then journalists, they are responsible for verifying the information, maintaining the objectivity, ensuring the story holds up legally and ethically, to different types of scrutiny. So as far as what type of evidence comes forward, I think that before you ever meet with the journalist or decide to meet with the journalist, you need to make sure that you know exactly what your facts are. If you have documentation to verify or corroborate what it is that you're coming forward with. But also keep in mind that whatever documentation you have, make sure that you aren't leaving digital footprints for yourself to be caught later on. Different government and corporations, they have very, very strict ways to be able to track what it is that you're printing off, or what it, make sure that you're using secure communications with whatever journalists you do decide to reach out to. I mean, these are all things that I think that sources or whistleblowers need to keep in mind before they ever even reach out to a journalist. How are you gathering this information? Are you making yourself, a target to suffer ramifications in gathering of this evidence, whatever the evidence might be?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think that the piece about gathering evidence is so critical. I think also, the forms that the evidence can take, it can be screenshots, it can be recordings, but you do have to be careful, because if you are, I've seen situations where people get recordings, but it's a one-party consent state, and then they get really scary legal letters from lawyers who are like, well, you recorded this, even though the recording was really valid, but you recorded this in a one-party consent state. And this is something most people just are not aware of. They're like, I have the recording, and therefore it must be like I have the smoking gun. And then, there are instances where people take photos or screenshots or download information from their work computers, and then they're being tracked by their employers. So, I've seen people use their spouses' phones to take pictures. And so there's many degrees of separation from that surveillance. But I think that the evidence definitely there is a higher bar to get any story out if it's ever like a he said, she said, or he said, or whatever it may be, without that evidence. So it is important that people are able to have something, but the gathering of it can be tricky. And I think that people, I think that's why it's important to have power in numbers, because if it is a workplace, it's the more, and sometimes it's not, if it's a lone whistleblower, that's very sensitive. But if there are a number of people sharing the same sort of a thing and multiple leaks, it's harder to detect who's doing that.
No, I appreciate that. So just a few minutes on, what's the difference between sort of being on background or off the record? I mean, what are some of those nuances?
I can take it. So on background, it's information that can be used or reported, but the source is not named directly. So instead of saying, Jackie with Whistleblowers of America, I might say, someone connected to, now I've put myself in a hole, but basically you're not naming them. You're trying to create an identifier that is accurate. You might say a high-level official or something like that. So that's on background. On deep background means information that can be used, but the journalist cannot attribute it even in a general way. It's meant to inform the reporting, but not directly quoted or traced back to a source. So an example might be a journalist, they learn about an upcoming policy change from a reliable source, but it presents as an independent reporting rather than attributing it to anybody directly. On the record, I think we all know what that means. I mean, what you were saying is you can be quoted, you can be attributed, name and title. Off the record, that information cannot be published, quoted, or attributed in any way. It's only for the journalist's knowledge and context. So if a politician tells me, I'm considering resigning, but you can't report that, it's off the record, both parties agree in advance that this conversation will not be leaked in any way, shape, or form. Let's see, I think those are the big ones. Was there any that I missed?
I don't think so. And I think, sorry. I think that most, there definitely are journalists who don't check whether, what someone's preference is. But in my experience, journalists are getting more and more careful because they're not going to get any future scoops or any information from people if they're known to be untrustworthy. That said, you still have to be careful, but there is, and I think more people, it's important that more people have media literacy, just because people don't know that you can have this variety of sharing information. So some people think that, oh my God, I DM'd a journalist and like it's going to be printed now, and like oftentimes it's like, well, you sent in a tip, but there's a lot more diligence that has to go into that, and there are many different ways in which you can contribute this information. So I think a lot of the general public just like doesn't know that because they don't work in the space.
Yeah, so Ariela, I'm reminded that, what was it, a month ago or so, you did a story on sort of on social media. So what's real and what's not real, and how do we as readers even know like what's a real story and what's fake news or alternate facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make these decisions? And is there an advantage then for me to go on one of the social media sites and just write my own story? What will that do? Like if like if CNN was going to pick that up, I mean, how likely is some of that relationship, or is there an intermix there?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question to unpack, like what's real and what's not. And I think people are still, like, everyone just on the internet these days is trying to discern that for themselves. Like I've even seen things on like Threads or Blue Sky, the new platform, where I'm like, I have to double check everything that's on there. But if it is linking out to like a legacy news outlet, like you can assume that it's been reported on and has truth to it. But I think that social media is now the way in which a lot of people are consuming their information. So it's become like this Wild West where like Gen Z is like getting most of their information from TikTok. So I actually think it's really important. And in my work, I encourage social media to be a piece of the strategy when it's safe, and to like see how that goes, how that resonates. Sometimes it even brings in more tips. Like I'm working on a story about the former head of information security at va.gov is speaking up about Doge. So I did a TikTok about what he had to say. It's also been reported on in news outlets. And a bunch of tips came into me, which I then brought to journalists. Like people were just DMing me. And so I do think that, and like those of course have to be vetted, but I do think that social media, for better or worse, is just where people's eyeballs are, and especially the younger generation. So there will have to be that bridge between legacy media and social media, so that people can, get more accurate information on social media, I think.
Mm-hmm. So, and what about the emotional toll of some of this? I mean, I think Ana-Claire, you mentioned a little bit. I mean, obviously, some of the reporting you've done has taken you to places, horrible places. But I think when working with whistleblowers, I obviously see a lot of what I think of as PTSD, anxiety, depression. What is it like to sort of unpack some of that, as you mentioned earlier, about the personal part of the story? What's that like to unpack, and how does that fit into the relationship?
Well, I think a journalist and a source's relationship is built on trust. I mean, it has to be built on trust, but it also, there needs to be boundaries, because there are risks on both sides, and relationships can break down. If a whistleblower might feel betrayed if a journalist doesn't publish the story quickly enough or like they envision, while a journalist might feel misled if a source, exaggerates or misrepresents claims, which can happen when you're so invested. If it's a personal, you're worried for your personal safety or your job or your family or whatever it might be. There's a lot of emotion and feeling and temper that goes into establishing that relationship from the start. And I think that you need to kind of set really clear boundaries from the beginning, have the conversation. A journalist that is well versed in this type of thing should have that conversation with the person, their source, that comes to them originally, and says, have you sought legal representation? Have you thought about the ramifications? Have you thought about the potential fallout that could happen when this story comes out? You know, those kind of honest and open communications, I think, that need to be had on the front end so that you don't get twisted up and kind of in a bad place, either the journalist or the whistleblower, you know, too far down into the story. But yeah, I think a lot of emotion, PTSD, it's really, really difficult to be able to put yourself out there and say, this is what I've experienced, and this, you know, I know this is wrong and I need to come out publicly, because as the journalist, you still have to be able to go through, you know, all the checks and balances that are required to verify that story. And sometimes your source might feel like, well, you don't believe me? You know, why do you have to check that? I told you this. And so it's a delicate balance that's built on trust. I mean, really at the core of it, I think that, you know, it's something that is, the risks on both sides can be really, really enormous. Investigating and publishing whistleblower accounts, it can lead to personal and professional risks for the journalists as well. So trying to keep that open line of communication from the very start, establishing those boundaries and being able to, when a boundary is crossed, have that conversation, that tough conversation, is incredibly important.
No, I appreciate that. You know, you're also reminding me that there's, you know, the risk of SLAPP suits, the strategic litigation against public participation. We've seen more and more journalists who have taken on the whistleblower story become part of the litigation as well. I think there have been cases recently involving some very famous people who have filed SLAPP suits against some of the major news outlets because they have felt like they were not portrayed accurately.
Right. And a lot of the times when you are speaking to a journalist, if they are from a major news outlet, they do have a legal team that is able to back them up and represent them, but the whistleblower might not. And the whistleblower needs to understand that I would say in the vast majority of cases, I don't want to say all, but in most cases, the journalist legal representation from their news organization is not going to also back up the whistleblower from their legal representation. So these are kind of conversations that you need to have with your source on the front end to let them know, hey, I might be protected legally, but you are not, unless you have secured that yourself.
Yeah, that's always a good idea. You know, when people tell me they want to talk to a journalist, I'm ready to tell the world my story. I was like, and have you first told it to an attorney? And how ready are you? So I appreciate that guidance. I think, you know, we live in a very litigious world, and right now there's just so much going on that I think people really do have to be a little bit more careful. So I know I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I see Mary Baker has had her hand raised, and I'm just going to be mindful, you know, that we're going to try to get in as many questions as we can tonight and as much discussion as we can. I'm just going to ask, please don't pitch a personal story right now. If you want to connect with either of these ladies or anybody else, you know, you can let me know and we can make that connection. But I want to keep this kind of a high conversation about process. And if you are thinking about wanting to talk to, oh, Mary doesn't know how to put her hand down.
Jackie, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Following the very copious notes I took from my mentor, Paul, he said this is about the time that I should unmute folks and
Yes.
let them use their own discretion about whether they should unmute themselves to speak. So I'm going to unmute everyone.
Yes.
Because I think I am.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to attempt to do that. How's that for you? And then people can use their judgment about when to speak. Oh, turn on the microphone. There we go. Paul would be so proud of me. All right.
All right.
Microphone's on.
Okay. Well, if Mary doesn't want to ask a question, we'll start with Heather because I saw her hand just went up.
And I turned on microphones and video as well.
We can hear you. And if you want to come on camera, we can hear you.
Okay, I tried to put my camera on. There it is.
Oh, there you are.
Okay, I filed a complaint with the Office of Inspector General and then got taken out from my job, and it was a big saga. And my local newspaper here in Fargo, North Dakota, did an amazing story, actually series of front page newspaper stories about it, and got good coverage. That was great. It saved my job. And then what it did is it brought 70 other people from my department out of the woodwork. And then I got all their stories. So then we communicated with several national media outlets, and multiple times, like, we talked to reporters and there was a lot of interest and we had numerous conversations, but then it would just go dead. And I never knew why. So I wondered if you have insight. Like, we had proof, we had numbers, there was public impact. I'm thinking it's just very competitive and there's a lot of bad stories, so maybe ours wasn't bad enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
so any insights on that?
it's really hard to know. I mean, I think that right now the news cycle is so intense and so fast. I mean, even stories that I was really passionate about, I couldn't get on, and I was internal, you know, and it might have been resources were cut. A lot of newsrooms are losing a lot of really incredible journalists, and, you know, you're having to do more work with less people. You might not have they might not have had, you know, the researchers to be able to dive into it. I don't know. It could be a lot of different reasons, but I wouldn't take that as, you know, your story wasn't worth having national attention. It could just be a very simple, like, the lack of resources in that particular media outlet wasn't available to be able to dig in deeply to it.
I'll add on to that. I agree with that I think it's usually a lack of resources, and that, like, the bar has become higher and higher for what the news outlets will cover. Like, if it's anything to do with Elon Musk, you know, that's the first thing that people are focused on. But it can be difficult because I think a lot of reporters are interested genuinely and want to, when they get back to you, they want to look further, but then they have like a million other things on their plates and their editors are turning them to other things. And it just is a time thing. And I think that's also why Substack and independent media outlets have sprung up as places for people to go to, and social media, as I mentioned before, which obviously has its flaws. But I think that it's great that there are more and more independent journalists, because then there are just more stories that can get out there that the big publications can't get to. And sometimes then, if it gets traction online from an independent journalist, then the outlets will say, oh, this has like significant interest online, so we're going to now put resources behind it.
I was curious if having local, go ahead, Ana-Claire.
No, I was going to say that if it's a local based story, being able to, if you're writing a summary in your pitch to a national audience, being able to tag it to like a wider kind of breadth than just whatever your specific nuance is. So if there's a way that you know, whatever it might be, if, you know, if the local outlets were really into it, but it doesn't seem like it's really ready for a national audience, that might also be a reason why it wasn't picked up. So sometimes in your pitch, in your conversations with journalists, think really clearly about what their audience is, because that's going to be the first thing in their mind.
I was curious if having the local journal covering it is like, well, that already got covered, so then it's not as interesting.
No, I don't think so. I mean, my entire career was at CNN. I started there when I was 22 years old, and they have really, really tight relationships with local affiliates. And a lot of times we would get tips from the local outlets, and we'd see like, oh, they're doing it, you know, whether it would be like an officer involved shooting or something that typically wouldn't rise to the national level. It would be the local affiliates that would call and say, hey, I think you need to take a look at this. So I don't think that it was that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen stories from, I remember there was something like in the Rhode Island Gazette, and the next thing I knew, I was getting calls from other reporters. Do you know about this story, and can we interview the whistleblowers? So, I mean, it can spin up, it can spin down. It might be a one-shot story, and then other times it grows. So I think it does vary. And I also see, I just wanted to call out, I saw that, I lost it, but I saw that Andrea from the Government Accountability Project, she put in the chat a link to a guide that they have published about, I guess, working with journalists. And I mean, I don't know if you want to explain more about what the link is, but that's what I think it is. And then, of course, GAP is, they offer legal representation for whistleblowers and about how to safely work with whistleblowers. They can guide you through that process a little bit more.
And Jackie, that link will be in this
Yes.
recording. So people are aware of that. If they can't write it down, they can access it right now.
So, and I also see Sophia had put a question in the chat about what are your recommendations for a whistleblower who has legal representation and wants to get media coverage. I'm assuming if the lawyer has said don't do it, but you want to do it anyway.
Yeah,
Can you?
I can jump in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry, ask your question. I thought Jackie was asking us to answer it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to clarify it. It's actually at what point, if the legal representation is okay with getting the coverage, how do you go about doing it to making sure it's a compelling story? And because I know, Jackie, I don't know if you recall my whole case with Amex or not, and there's so many different layers to it where there's already information out in the media about my former employer, and then wanting to add my piece to it with the legal representation, trying to see if getting the attorneys to want to listen, not attorneys, excuse me, the media coverage to want to hear not just my story, but how it's linked to what's already out there to make it even a bigger story.
So I'd say, prepare your evidence really thoughtfully. So you want to gather your documents, your emails, recordings, whatever it is, to be able to back up what you're saying. Write a clear summary. We call it a pitch, but it's basically just a why should I care? Well, how does this affect more than just you? How does it affect a larger group of people? And why does the public need to know about this? And then be honest and transparent. One of the things that I find is incredibly helpful when you're dealing with people with source information is that if they don't know the answer to something, they say, I don't know, because what you don't want is to be able to fill in the blanks for, and then be incorrect. So exaggeration or incomplete details, it really can weaken your credibility with the journalist. And then once you've found a journalist to speak to, you found somebody that you think would be interested based on their past, work, or they've shown interest in reporting on things of that nature into other outlets, whatever it might be, that's when you have the conversation with them to establish the trust and then set boundaries.
I would also add that, I love lawyers, and I think that they are so necessary, obviously, in this kind of work. But sometimes from a story perspective, if you have too many lawyers involved and it's too legalese, then it can lose the very human element to it of what could connect it to just a random person who's come across the story. So I think it's important to also follow the lawyer's advice, but not go too down that path of thinking that you're in court. Because then it can sometimes just come off as very sterile, I think, to people. So I think that's the only other thing I would add.
I see Tia and then Nick have had their hands up. So Tia, you're next. You need to come off mute.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Thank you so much. I heard either Ariela or Ana-Claire say earlier about being very careful not to be specific and call names, use names specifically, and or even any identifying factors. And because I'm writing about a very large public retail company, retail grocer, that has not been mentioned in the news at all about this story in any way, shape, or form. Can I use titles like CEO, district manager, store manager?
Are you, sorry, I'm just a little confused by the question. Are you the one that's writing it? Are you the journalist writing it? Or?
Thanks. That's a good question. I'm actually writing my own press release, and I've cherry picked a list of journalists. It's extremely unusual. Usually I write press releases for clients or for my employer, but I'm actually sending my own press release So there you have it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that you'd have to make the determination, but I think what I was referring to when I was talking about that is when you're having a conversation with the source and you say, you know, is this off the record? Is this on background? Is this on deep background? Things like that. You know, somebody that might be a store manager doesn't want to be identified as a store manager. So you would just say, you know, somebody that works closely with the company or something like that. You have the conversation with your source beforehand about how they're going to be identified in the story. So for your particular specific case, I'm not entirely sure how you want to handle that, but that's what I was referring to earlier.
Oh, actually, they're not the sources. They would be, I guess, for lack of a better word in this moment, perpetrators in the story.
I would say that, so you then get into sometimes like tricky defamation situations if they can become identifiable, especially if they're not public people. So I would say that, you know, it's hard. How big is the company? Is it a very large company or a large retailer?
It is, you know, it's not on a level of a Walmart, but it's national.
Publicly traded.
Publicly traded. They're also going through their own, right now, some big changes, which is not a part of my story, but it can't be ignored.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. I think the more people who are listed and also the more like it can backfire in that you have, if they are ever identified, there could be a defamation sort of a claim. But then at the same time, people don't want to identify themselves as the store manager if they are the ones being represented poorly. So it's such a case-by-case thing. But I think in my experience, I have worked with people who have said, you know, this district sales representative or this head of commercial real estate, and they've like talked about people's positions because it adds to the story and the journalistic integrity of it. And I've rarely seen like those people then out themselves if they're portrayed. But then you know you never know. You have to be careful, especially if it's like a private individual and the allegations are not documented in a lawsuit.
And also keep in mind, you know, if you are pitching this to a journalist, and the journalist might want to do their due diligence and go, if you're identifying them in a way that they're easily identifiable, go talk to that person directly and get their side of things.
Yeah, I've seen where that has backfired on people because you give the reporter the story, but then the reporter is neutral in the story. They're not reporting on a story to tell your side. You've given them information, and then they're going to go interview the exact person you said is the perpetrator, and then that person is going to tell their side of the story with the way they want to color the facts, and it could really paint you or what you're trying to report in a really negative light. So, I mean, you always have to be really mindful of what will the other side say when they're interviewed.
And I think that's really important, Jackie. Like whistleblowers, they need to understand that once they go public with a journalist, journalists must maintain their editorial independence. So that means that the whistleblower cannot control how the story is framed or guarantee a certain outcome. And any journalist that tries to tell you what an outcome will be, you probably shouldn't be talking to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really good points because I have seen it where it has backfired. And then, you know, the whistleblower might want to correct the story or add to the story, and the journalist has moved on. Like, hey, I've already done that story. I'm not doing it again.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it sure makes it tricky because I don't want it to be boring and coming just from me because none of the other persons involved, I guess the harmed persons, floor level personnel, they have zero interest in talking to the press. Zero. I'm the only one, but then again, too, I have a very different background. So this is who I am. And I could not say anything, but I thank you very much.
Okay. So I see Nick and then Bali.
Yeah. Hey guys, question on process. So I'm working with a ProPublica right now, a well-respected journalist in ProPublica. However, my lawyers are very clear that because my case is under seal and there's 4 investigations going on, that the federal U.S. government is actually investigating my former employer, which is a New York Stock Exchange listed company, and then also a competitor, which is a larger company. It's about a $40 billion company. So they're being investigated for price fixing and some other sinister things. The main question I have is so my ProPublica reporter has said to me, once you get a determination from OSHA as the primary investigator in this particular case, once you get a primary ruling from OSHA, she said she can do a FOIA request on the case, take out all the information, it'll be redacted, names will be redacted, and then she can then write the case. And then if I could then work with her to, be interviewed in that case. Does that seem like a solid approach, or like what other things should I be thinking about from a standpoint of working with the journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that she's able to get through FOIA is wonderful. A lot of times it takes an extraordinarily amount of time to be able to get the Freedom of Information Act documentations, and sometimes they're heavily redacted to the point where you can't even make sense heads or tails of it. But I think that she's doing exactly what she needs to be doing and trying to independently verify what it is that you're saying, or, I don't know your specific case, but any additional information that she can get from an alternative source besides just you is so important. So yeah, it sounds like she's on exactly the right track.
Okay, and then so I guess there's a timing question, right? So this case involves a known reproductive toxin that's in new cars that leaks out into evaporators. So if you're a young female, there's a chance that you could be getting exposed to a reproductive toxin, and it's highly likely. And the companies that sold that product knew that, because they buried some toxicological studies, and I happen to know about them. And because the lawyer told me, he was unburdening himself, and he told me, so now I've got this whistleblower case on my hands. So it's a public story. It needs to be known. But so I don't know really the timing of when should I really start to tell my lawyers, hey, it's time to really press this forward, because the public needs to know, how do I think about timing of this case?
Are there other people aware of this? Or are you the only one?
No, nobody knows about this.
Nobody knows.
Absolutely no one. No.
And
When
everything.
you say,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, no, I was going to say, when you're talking to your lawyer, are you meaning either push through legally and make that public before the journalist has time to be able to file their report, or is that kind of the decision that you're making?
Well, so the decision is there's going to be a ruling, right? So OSHA is going to make a ruling. They're going to say your case has merit, yes or no. It's very likely that the case is going to have merit. So if the case has merit, I guess the question is, then what? Is that the time to pick up the phone and call ProPublica and say, okay, the case has merit, do your investigation and I'll cooperate with you? Or should I then say, okay, my case has merit, and now I'm going to get a trial attorney and file, a 30-page complaint against the company, for other, actually there's a criminal case too here that we won't even talk about the criminal side of it. But yeah, so I guess the question is, how do I think about engaging the ProPublica to get the story out? Because in my opinion, people need to know about this, right? This is not something that's just you just throw this.
Why can't you do both of those routes simultaneously? I mean, because when you engage the journalist, I would imagine, based on just the very limited amount that I know, it's going to take them months and months of investigative work to be able to put something together. So, I'm speaking from a journalist here. I'd rather know sooner rather than later, because when you tell them, they're not going to go to air or publish immediately. At least, it's going to take a lot of time, verification, source protection, framing it, exposing You know, there's just so much that's involved with doing a deep dive investigation like that. You know, the longer you give them to be able to really dig deep, probably the better the story is going to be.
There are also shield laws that protect your conversation with that journalist. So it's not quite the same as attorney-client privilege, but like you know, your conversations are more protected with a journalist in a lot of states than with other people. So you can come to them with, you know, in confidence and start sharing that information with them, but be very clear up front about your timeline and what your lawyers advise. And I've also seen people go against the advice of their lawyers sometimes if they just feel like they have to. It's like a moral or spiritual, or like they're like, I just have to share this. I've seen people break gag orders, and strangely sometimes they're like totally okay because they're like, I just feel freer doing that. But it really depends on your risk tolerance and what your lawyers are saying, and you have to weigh all of it.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And if you trust the journalist, you can have that conversation where you can say, you know, hey, it's working through the courts right now. I'm not ready for this to be public yet, but I think you should know about this so that you can go ahead and get a leg up on it. Are you okay? Are we in agreement? Will you do that with me?
Oh, no,
if they know, then that's fine.
Oh, no, that water's already under the bridge. She's just waiting for me to come back and say, are you willing to go on the record with this? She's like, I'm writing this. I've already got the story started, because she knows how important it is for people, like for humans. I mean, this stuff is in 250 million cars, guys. And they knew it.
Incredible. I can't wait to read it when she publishes.
And they knew it. And it just, I just want to get it right. And I don't want to, and I don't want them to come after me for defamation. I mean, my neighbor's a lawyer, and he said, look,
as long as it's true.
That's right. They're like, hey, you the
As
best
long
defense
as you've
is
got
defamation. It's
and
true.
then that goes back to the evidence. As long as you have evidence and the proof, you should be right. I want to move us along though, because I know Bali had a question as well.
Yeah, actually, this might be too field specific, but I was just curious about national security whistleblowers, because it seems like in the last maybe 10 years, there have been all these people that went to jail, you know, like Reality Winner and Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, or, you know, Snowden ended up in Russia. And I'm not quite clear, like, what has changed since, like, Daniel Ellsberg, who's considered a hero, right, for leaking, you know, the Pentagon Papers. And these other people, you know, came forward with, you know, to journalists and then ended up in jail. And I think 2 people have actually publicly criticized a particular journalist associated with The Intercept for, they felt like, not handling their, you know, their confidential materials in a way that, you know, ended up with them being identified. So I'm just curious, do you feel like, are there fewer whistleblowers coming forward now between that and, you know, defamation suits, like against, you know, powerful men who've been accused of sexual harassment? Like, are people more afraid to talk to a journalist now because they see that, you know, there's these people who've come forward and been really seriously harmed, you know, by what they thought was in the public interest?
In my experience, and maybe this is just like following the Trump administration's coming into power, like there are more whistleblowers than ever. I think there definitely is a response to whatever has come before. So I remember when the Amber Heard trial happened, and people, like women, were like, I had a story, but I saw what happened and I just don't want to go down that path. And yes, to your point, Reality Winner. And you also see, like, it's sort of crazy how then Hollywood makes these like stories off of these people like Reality Winner, and oftentimes the whistleblowers who like aren't even, they're in jail, or like it's really sad to see. And so I think that it definitely, for a period of time, there was hesitation because of what came before. Now I'm just seeing that people are so alarmed by what's going on that they're more willing. But I think it's really connected to what's happening culturally. That's what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's particularly strange because, you know, Amber Heard won her suit in England, right? So it's like, sometimes it just seems so arbitrary. Like, you win here, you lose there. You're a hero in this situation. you're a traitor in a similar situation, so it just seems very kind of risky, you just don't know how things are going to go. Yeah.
Totally. And I think Jackie has also done so much work around, how whistleblowers are seen in the culture, and like changing the diction or the synonyms in the dictionary for whistleblower, because now the synonyms are like rogue, tattletale, snitch, those are the synonyms. And certainly there are some people who like have want to avenge something, but then there are other people who are just like truth. They want to tell the truth. They want to be a conduit for something that's actually happening. So I think that there has to be also like a public re-education of what a whistleblower is, because I do think that you're right with the Pentagon papers. He was seen as a hero, and then the like image of the whistleblower got tarnished as this like rogue person who wants attention and just wants to go against the grain for no good reason. So I think that but now I think like today, what day is it? February 25th, 2025. More whistleblowers coming to me than in the past like year or two. I think maybe in part because of what's going on politically and the fact that we're like heading into this sort of autocratic situation.
So first of all, thank you for plugging what we call our whistle words, or a 6-word story campaign. I just put it in the chat. We're always looking for people who will fill out the survey that we have on that website page, as well as anybody who wants to make their own 6-word story. And we call it a 6-word story because we're trying to look at synonyms, and it goes back to the Hemingway, can you tell a story in 6 words? Yes. Baby shoes for sale, never worn. So you can make something concise, and that's what we're looking for, is ways to call attention to that negative stereotyping, and we're asking people for better words. And we have a couple of really good 6-word stories now already on our website. And I also put in the chat, we're going to close our mental health survey this week. It'll probably be the last week that we leave it open. So there's the Qualtrics link for the survey. It's another way of sharing your story anonymously and helping us improve on the data. So I think there are other ways of storytelling. We've talked about building narratives, and I think we're going to do a session on that. I'm also reminded about international whistleblowers. I think I've seen people have logged on tonight with out of the US phone numbers. When I see all those long numbers, I know it's not an American phone number.
I saw a couple UK numbers.
Yeah, I think I can't remember what I saw, but I think I saw some international people logged on. Is that harder or easier if the source is outside the United States? Or does it matter?
It's so dependent on the situation. I think, yeah, it's so case by case. If there were a specific example, I mean, I think that so sometimes there's a language barrier, and that can be difficult. Like recently, and like a time zone barrier, which seems very like silly to bring up, but sometimes it's like, well, you can't. There's like an hour window where you can talk, and there are different like cultural implications of certain things. I don't know, Ana-Claire, you've done a lot of work abroad, right?
Yeah, I've done a lot of international reporting, and I think that, I've had cases where I wouldn't have called them whistleblower, I would have called them sources, but same difference. In a lot of cases where in international arenas where I knew that the information that they were telling me could get them shot on the spot in their countries. So these, there have been cases where we've had to make accommodations for these people to be able to get them out of the country after they've told us information that was sensitive enough to make it impossible for them to continue to live in that country safely. People have taken great personal risk to be able to tell us information that they felt like that the public needed to know. But I never took for granted their their safety by doing that. So it's something that was always like really at the top of my mind. But at the same time, you know, as a journalist, you want to try and have those conversations with people before they tell you that information that could potentially get them killed. But we can't carry all the responsibility either. So it's really, it's difficult. I've had sources that have disappeared. I don't know what happened to them. And I carry them with me still to this day. Yeah, it's difficult. But you know,
I know what
a lot
happened
of
to him.
times, well, yeah, a lot of times the conversations, not every time, but a lot of time the conversations we have of, you know, are you sure that this is something that you want reported? Is, yeah, it's worth everything. It's worth my life for people to know. So, you know, I think that it's different in every scenario, but I do take a lot of stock into what people are telling me, because I do know the real ramifications of what could happen when they do share what they know.
All right. Well, any final words? We're like at the 1 hour mark. I know we started a little late.
You got to end on a happier note than that, though, Jackie.
Well, and I also see Bob just put his hand up. So if you have a quick question.
Yeah, it's a quick follow-up question. Can you hear me? I don't know if my
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
to Ana-Claire, which is, do you ever tell a whistleblower, hey, I've thought about your story, what you're trying to release, and I don't think it's worth your life. I'm just going to turn you down because I know you really believe that, but I don't want you injured in some terrible way for this particular amount of data that you have with the story?
I haven't had that exact conversation, but I've had conversations similar in the sense that I've said, you know, I know that you think that this is worth risking everything, but this, you just don't have enough right now. You don't have enough, and it's not something that I think that you need to go public with right now until we have more that can validate what you're saying. Because even though I might believe you and I think that what you're saying is 100% true, I have no other way of proving it. So do not risk your life at this exact moment.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, they don't always listen to me. They might go and do whatever, but it's like my conscience feels like I need to say that.
Okay. Thank you.
Any last closing thoughts?
I have a question. Yes, I have a quick question, and I hope this is a happier note. I'm actually creating and sending along with my press release a print PSA, and it does have to do with rats in retail and how to mitigate that, etc. And one of the invitations in the PSA is for retail workers to take certain steps. There's 2 PSAs, one for shoppers and one for workers. And on the worker PSA, I wanted to list some whistleblower resources. And I know OSHA has a whistleblower specific department, but I wanted to know if this organization, if I could, list your organization, if that would even be appropriate, or that's my question.
So we definitely have a list of resources on our website. And I know the House Whistleblower Ombuds Office has a really good list of resources as well for whistleblowers. They've done a great job of putting together information like that. And then, of course, we do these every month. So March 25th will be our next roundtable. We'll announce the topic here soon. I can't remember if we've already set that up yet or not. But so more to come. I did in the chat, just as a reminder, there's the guide for working with the media from GAP. Our survey is in there if you want to grab some quick links, and our 6-word story. Our website we have a new feature, our news. We're going to try to put up some of the links to some of the stories. I also put our testimony from today up there. And, I know that for many of us, whether we're government employees or have been government employees or are contractors or grants, or so many people right now have just been sharing so many stories like SNAP being reduced and home health being reduced. And Ana-Claire, I was talking to one of my compatriots in the Ukraine, and she gave me a list of all the things that USAID was funding for them that are now gone, which included things like medical care for prosthetics and healthcare, and their anti-corruption programs, and in Mexico, their human trafficking programs. So I think we're going to just see whistleblowing coming at us from all kinds of sectors as we unpack some of what's going on in the world today. So I appreciate both of you joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in the papers.